And one of the rising stars of alternative media is our next speaker. He's a young man. To me, at my age, he looks like a very young man. But he is speaking so clearly and so well that he has built up a genuinely massive international audience. He is, of course, Richard Medhurst. Please welcome to the
Thank you for that introduction, George. You're very kind. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to the organizers of the event. My name is Richard Thomas Medhurst. I'm an independent journalist. As you can tell by my very English name, I'm British. The Louvre Museum in Paris once had a director named André Parot. He was a French archaeologist. And he did a lot of work in Syria and in that region, and he viewed it as so important to our human heritage as the cradle of civilization that he said every man has two countries, his own and Syria. And for me that's quite literally the case. From my mother's side, my family is Syrian Christian, so I've been very blessed, privileged in my life to have Arabic as a second native language, and to understand and to be immersed in the Syrian Arab culture. At the same time, I've had my eyes open to what NATO exactly is, because NATO member states have been waging a proxy war against Syria in the same way they've been waging a proxy war against Ukraine. And since 2014, since the Maidan coup, you've had people burnt alive in Odessa. You've had NATO training Ukrainian troops for interoperability with other Ukrainian troops. The Minsk agreements fell through. And unbeknownst to many, because the media don't do their jobs, you've had thousands of ethnic Russians and Russian speakers killed in the eastern parts of Ukraine in the Donbass region. Now, I know it's very easy in the West, it's very comfortable in the middle of London to just get on the podium and start criticizing Russia and pointing fingers at other people because we're not there. It's very comfortable. It's too easy to do that. It's too simple. And this event, this is about opposition to war and opposition to NATO. So what is NATO? Well, NATO was originally created, supposedly, to protect us from the evil Soviet Empire. What Soviet Empire? We're in 2023. I was born in 92. My entire life, there has been no Soviet Union. Why did NATO double its membership from 15 to 30 members? And now we've got Finland and Sweden on the way to protect us from some imaginary Soviet Union? What's going on? And so, during the 2+4 negotiations, our Western diplomats told the Russians that if they support German reunification between East and West, they won't expand NATO. Well, that was a lie. You can go online right now, you don't have to take my word for it, and just look up the minute meetings, right? The meetings minutes. So these are the recordings from the meetings. Our diplomats talking amongst themselves how we won't expand NATO, and it's out of the question to put Poland into NATO because Poland's a Soviet satellite state. And here we are, Poland is in NATO. So we have crept up on Russia's doorstep. What do you think the Russians are thinking when they look at that? This is not rocket science. This is a very, very simple, basic rule of geopolitics and international relations. When you have an adversarial military alliance on your doorstep, you're going to freak out. If Ireland and the French jumped into a military alliance with Russia, we would freak out. Yes? If Canada and Mexico jumped into bed with Russia in a military alliance, the Americans would freak out. And there's no need to hypothesize. You can go and just look at the Cuban Missile Crisis. They drummed that into your heads at school, right? It's considered one of the most important points in the entire Cold War. And a lot happened during the Cold War. That's how threatened the Americans felt, that we still talk about that to this day because the Soviets put missiles in Cuba. So we're just supposed to assume that they don't feel threatened when we are at their doorstep? What kind of thinking is that? And then you have people say, no, but come on. NATO is a defensive alliance. It's a defensive alliance. So when NATO bombed Serbia, they bombed Yugoslavia, that was defensive. Yeah? When they bombed the Chinese embassy, that was defensive. When they bombed the TV station, that was defensive. When they sent NATO-backed rebels to lynch Gaddafi on camera like some rabid animal, that was defensive. They bombed the largest the great man-made river, the largest irrigation project on this planet. That was defensive. That's civilian infrastructure. They turned Libya into a failed state. I love how we just go and destroy countries and call them failed states like we had absolutely nothing to do with it. It's a failed state. They're just stupid, you know. That was defensive, apparently. We turned the most prosperous nation in Africa into a failed state. It's got slave markets now. It was all defensive. And then, of course, we have our special forces, the SAS, running around with the Australian SAS, executing young Afghan boys and men in their sleep, in their homes, planting weapons on them. That's also defensive, apparently. We occupied Afghanistan for 20 years. That was defensive. Obama was drone striking funerals, drone striking weddings in Yemen and Pakistan. Also defensive. And then Trump goes and bombs Syria over some fake chemical attack that never happened with other NATO member states, with the French, with our planes, and that was also defensive. Well, you know, I'm calling up my cousins one by one to see if they're okay. And then Turkey, another NATO member state, is letting fighters come into Syria, is letting weapons come into Syria, and buying oil off of ISIS. And at the same time, the Americans have a rat line. That's Operation Timber Sycamore. $1 billion. It's one of the most expensive operations. Just running weapons from Libya into Syria into the hands of jihadists. We killed 1 million people in Iraq with the Americans. 1 million people. We made millions more refugees. Apparently, that was also self-defense. We have an entire Arab leadership executed on camera. Saddam Hussein, Colonel Gaddafi, executed on camera. That was defensive. We have a pretty funny definition of defensive at NATO, don't we? Where was the outrage? Where was the outrage? Every single day there's outrage, there's empathy, there's an outpouring of support for Ukraine. And surely there should be. But where was the outrage for all of this, all these massacres that NATO perpetrated? Where was it? There's nothing. We killed millions. No outrage. The other day, after the earthquake in Syria, Israel, while people are still under the rubble, Israel bombed Syria. Where was the outrage? The Israelis raided the West Bank in Nablus. They killed 11 Palestinians, a 16-year-old boy, 3 elderly men above the age of 60. That was also something self-defense. Was it again? No outrage whatsoever. We just reward them with more weapons, we give them more political coverage, we give them all that they need. And then when it comes to Russia, we start to point the finger. We have no legitimacy. Don't talk to me about Russia violating international law or Russia annexing this and that. We invented this stuff. We invented this crap. You know, there's a UN peacekeeping and observer mission in the Golan Heights, where my parents worked. Why do you think there's a UN mission there? Because the Israelis illegally annexed it. They illegally annexed East Jerusalem. They're occupying the West Bank. And all of a sudden, our politicians have learned these words. They have them in their vocabulary. They know what territorial integrity is. They know what sovereignty is. They finally know what occupation is. How interesting. Well done. I'm proud of them. How about you use that language when you talk about Israel then? How about you use that language when you talk about what we are doing to the rest of the world? Where is the language that you selectively use when it suits you? Ridiculous. You know, Tony Blair, he lied about chemical weapons and biological weapons in Iraq, and we felt so threatened that we just had to go into Iraq. We just had to kill 1 million people. We and the Americans, we felt so threatened we just had to go into Afghanistan and occupy it for 20 years. We come up with any excuse we like, right? We have the right to feel threatened and react, but the Russians don't. And the irony is, at least the Russians can make a case, because we're actually at their doorstep. We're the ones who armed Saddam Hussein originally, and we're the ones who created Al-Qaeda. What case do we have? We have no case whatsoever. We lied, and we exaggerate, and we go wherever we want, and then we have the nerve to talk about the Russians, and to talk about whoever we don't like on this, who happens to be the enemy of the day. Now listen, some of you don't like Russia. Some of you don't care what Russia's reasons are. Some of you hate Putin. All you want is for Russia to get out of Ukraine, and you want the killing to stop, and you want peace. Fine, I agree with you. I also want peace. But we're not going to get peace through World War III. We're not going to get peace by bombing each other until there's no planet left. We're not going to get peace by rearming Germany. The Soviets, they lost more than anyone, perhaps more than anyone in World War II. They fought alongside us against the Nazis. They lost 27 million people. 27 million people. They paid very dearly. They were the first to reach Berlin. They inflicted 80% of all German casualties. 80%, 8 with a 0. 8 with a 0 on the Russian front. That doesn't mean we didn't do anything, but they did the heavy lifting. The numbers speak for themselves. And we think it's a good idea to let Germany send tanks to kill Russians again in Ukraine again. Have we gone mad? This is lunacy. This is lunacy. This is the same country that killed 6 million Jews and Roma and Slavs. This is the same country that bombed this city every single night for months on end. My grandmother was hit by a V1 right here in London. We're letting them rearm? That country, they can rearm? They're spending more than Russia on their weapons now, than Russia does in a year. This is madness. This is absolute madness. What have we achieved? We have Germany rearmed. We have Russia walking out of START New, which was the only thing holding together any sort of limits on nuclear warheads. The Norwegians and the Americans thought it was a good idea to blow up our only cheap source of gas in Europe. They destroyed our critical civilian infrastructure. They let out all this methane into the sea. And they're supposedly allies. Wow. They blow up our pipelines and they're allies. That's funny. Who needs enemies with friends like that? Over 100,000 Ukrainians have been killed. Millions have been made refugees. Germany's rearmed. We've got the Americans, our friends, blowing up our pipelines with Norway. Does this spell out success to you? Is that your version of success? What kind of strategy is this? Now, Russia certainly shares a part of the blame, but who egged on the Russians? Who kept provoking the Russians? Who kept poking the bear? You can't just take geopolitics and international relations out of the equation and act like encircling Russia just doesn't matter. It does bloody matter. That's the whole problem. It doesn't mean that the Ukrainians deserve everything that's happening because they wanted to be in the EU and they wanted to be in NATO. It's not about that. It's about the Americans using Ukraine against the Russians. That's the problem. And then they put sanctions on top of it. And these sanctions are apparently so good that oil and gas prices are up, food prices are up, rent and mortgages are all up. Christ, are you sanctioning the Russians or us? The Russian ruble was the best performing currency last year, yeah? French glass industry is on the verge of collapse. German steel industry is on the verge of collapse. And at this rate, I guess the Americans are seeing this as a good thing, because if Europe is deindustrialized, where do you think these companies are going to go? They're going to the United States. Then they put the G7 price cap on them as well. And this is also so brilliant that not a single barrel of oil has actually been hit by this cap. We think we're so smart that if we stop buying Russian oil, they won't have any revenue. Well, guess what? It turns out China and India exist, and they're buying Russian oil like there's no tomorrow. So well done about that. Ridiculous. The truth is that sanctions don't work. They tell you they target leaders. They don't target leaders. That's a lie. That is a goddamn lie. Go ask the people in Venezuela if they feel that their government is targeted or they feel targeted. Go ask people in Iran. Go ask people in Syria. I can tell you my family certainly feel targeted by those sanctions. They have nothing to do with Assad. There's no fuel, there's no food. How does that happen? We're supposed to believe that this is about targeting the leadership? That's a lie and they know it. But in our arrogance, we become so accustomed to just squashing other countries, we thought that sanctioning the Russians would be a walk in the park. It's going to be just like those other countries. No, it's not. We're getting a taste of our own medicine now, and it doesn't taste very good, does it? The thing is that the West is in decline, and the East is on the rise. The Russians have options. The Russians have other customers for their cheap gas and their oil. The Russians are building a multipolar world with the Indians, with the Chinese, and everybody else, basically the entire global South, which is, I know we like to think the West is the rest of the world. It's not. It's far bigger than that. And you have people, meanwhile, in the West, homeless cities in America, tent cities, people sleeping on the streets, people sleeping rough here. People are becoming poorer. They can't pay their bills. And they talk about the environment and they hold all these big conferences and talk about climate change. Is waging war good for the climate? How is the Pentagon, being the world's largest polluter, good for the climate? How is using depleted uranium shells good for the climate? Why don't you go look at what's that done to children in Fallujah, who to this day, the babies have birth defects that are so horrendous because of what the Americans did there with depleted uranium. 2 weeks ago, there was a train derailment in Ohio in East Palestine. The toxic chemicals are spilling into the soil, into the river. And people are absolutely, certainly going to get hurt from this, unfortunately. But Biden cares so much about them and about the environment, he decided to go to Ukraine. You know, there won't be a climate if there's nuclear war. I don't know if this is simple enough to grasp, but if we blow each other to bits, there will not be a climate or an environment to care about. And I wonder why we spend all this money on Ukraine and we don't care about our own. We don't care about our own countries. We don't fix our own countries. Every time junior doctors and nurses ask for raises, we tell them no, but when it comes to war, we say yes. And when it comes to the rail workers and the transportation workers, we tell them no, but when it comes to war, we say yes. When it comes to the teachers, we say no. When it comes to war, we say yes. The money's there, they just don't want to use it. It's just not suitable for them. It's just not convenient. Not good enough. Ridiculous, because now we're banning books also, and we're banning television channels that we don't like. Is that freedom of speech? Is that democracy? Are these the European values, the Western values we keep hearing about? Let's ban the BBC then. Let's ban the Guardian. What do you say? Yeah? Come on, why not? I recall many outlets, and none of them independent, most of them mainstream, who were cheering on the war in Syria, the war in Libya, who cheered on all of these NATO wars. They have far more blood on their hands than any of these outlets that they've banned, if it's really about that. We're banning Russian athletes as well, right? We played cat and mouse with them. Oh, you have to criticize Putin publicly, and then when some of them did it, we still banned them anyway, just because they have the wrong citizenship. I wonder how England makes it into the World Cup. Well, I wonder that every 4 years, but the thing is, no, I love our three lions, but at that rate, how is David Beckham allowed to captain the England team after what we did in Iraq? How is Lewis Hamilton allowed to drive an F1 Formula car after what we did in Iraq? It's ridiculous. And any form of critical thinking is banned now. There's no dissent allowed. I think David Miller was talking about this just earlier. He's an example of that. How any sort of dissent to establishment orthodoxy is completely punished. We are dumbing ourselves down. People like Chomsky, like Mearsheimer, like Sachs, they're called Putin apologists. Just cast aside anyone you don't like. They're trying to make people more dumb. They don't want you to hear the other side of the story so you can make an informed decision on your own as an adult, as a human being. You have to listen to what the government is saying, and that's it. End of story. We tell the Russians to get out in the streets and protest their government, but when we do it, apparently we're apologists for Putin. We tell Putin not to jail journalists, and Julian Assange is in a maximum security prison just a few miles away from here. Julian Assange is in a prison. He's in a prison where we put terrorists. What right do we have to lecture anyone? Another Australian hero, David McBride, is facing prison time For what? Because he exposed NATO war crimes in Afghanistan. That's how we treat whistleblowers and journalists in the West. We jail them, and then we point fingers at other countries. You see, our foreign policy towards Ukraine has been an absolute failure. All we have done is not only cause this war, we've prolonged it. We have the blood of all these precious Russian and Ukrainian souls on our hands. That's what our governments have done. Their strategy is a failing strategy. They've sent all the weapons that they want to send. They've done everything that they have done. They've banned and cancelled everyone they wanted to cancel. And then what? Their strategy doesn't work. And this is why we need a rigid, invigorated anti-war movement. That is why this is so important. Because there is an alternative. And let me just say as a side note, I know it's very privileged to start to split hairs about who you want to be within the anti-war movement. You know, people who are on the receiving end of our foreign policy, of Western foreign policy, they don't have this luxury. They don't have the time and the effort, literally, to start splitting hairs about who is going to be on their side and stop the bombs falling and the sanctions starving them. They don't have this luxury. And just keep in mind, a classic FBI tactic during the Cold War to crush anti-war movements, among others, was to cause infighting, tell a lie about him, spread a rumor about her, get them quarreling with each other, and then no one's going to focus on the message. Don't do their job for them. Jesus Christ, don't make their job easier for them. What the hell? Don't be stupid. Don't be stupid. You're playing into their hands. This is exactly what they want. You know, if we continue down this road, we are on a very, very dangerous path. We are going to end up with World War III and nuclear war. And I know that sounds very explosive, quite literally, and fear-mongering. It's really not. You don't have to take my word, because both President Biden and President Putin have said the exact same thing, that we are closer to nuclear confrontation than ever before. Ever before. Can you imagine what that means, that even during the Cold War it didn't get this bad? That really says a lot. Let that sink in. Just think about that. This is worse than during the Cold War. And all it takes is one mistake, you know. It just takes one push of the button and it's game over. There's no coming back from that. We will all be gone. And there have been occasions during the Cold War, if you know your Cold War history, where because of human error, we were on the verge of nuking each other because someone misread a radar screen. And thank God it didn't come to that. The stakes are much higher now. The stakes are much higher. We don't have any room for error right now. We cannot afford it. Tanks and jets are not doing it for Ukraine. Sending more weapons is not going to stop the war. We need diplomacy and we need an anti-war movement. And that's why I'm here today. I'm here to rally you. I'm here to rally the troops. I want all of you to get out there and organize and create these marches. You know, when I think back to the Iraq war, there's 1 million people that came out in the streets here in London. That's what I want to see. That is what I expect of people. That is what we need. That is what it takes. These suits driving around in their Bentleys, they don't represent us. They don't represent you, they don't represent me, they don't represent Russians or Ukrainians. They have nuclear bunkers, we don't. Do you understand? It's up to us now to declare war on the war machine. War on the warmongers. War on the war puppeteers. War on the war hawks. This is our declaration of war. No to war and no to NATO. My name is Richard Medhurst. Thank you very much.
Magnificent, Richard. Magnificent.